Hello, I'm George. This is GLLR Cars. This time we're talking about some tips and some advice in terms of being able to afford a car that would be one of your early cars for yourself or for someone early in their lives. If you're looking to buy a car, and I'm using this as an example, this is the Ford Focus, 2014 Ford Focus, and it is the Titanium Edition. This car was a purchase that happened when the car was about a few months past the calendar year. So in 2015, and just before the spring of 2015, this car was still in a dealer lot, and the dealer was very motivated to be able to sell cars and move cars from the lot, and this would normally be a car that would not have so many incentives, but they did. So again, being a new car with 0 miles but being sold on the year that was not the calendar year, it's considered a sound decision. Most of the hassle of trying to afford a car that normally would cost more disappears, because many of those discounts and incentives are there in place already. So if you are in that position where you're trying to buy a car, when you are looking to get something that's going to last you a little bit, and maybe something that hasn't been abused, or something that you want it to be your first love, I would say that do shop wisely, do look for those type of situations. But in general, it's all about how much car for the money, and is it something that you will truly like because it's something that you fell in love with. So if you think about a car that you own in the past and you didn't care too much about it, you didn't clean it, you left dirty clothing in the back seat, open soda cans on the floor, you didn't wash it on a regular basis, and you had to maybe wipe down with a piece of cloth or a napkin when you got to a gas station to put gas, well, that's when you know you don't really like your car. It is not your love. It is just something that gets you from point A to point B. And when do you know that you really like a car? It is the one that you always wanted to see it clean, that it really bugs you whenever it's dirty or it's got watermarks, that you always pick up from the floor any little piece of paper or any debris, even a receipt. You go to, say, a Starbucks or any shop, and they give you a receipt and you forgot to put it in your pocket, and you don't want that receipt to be sitting in that cup holder. That's when you really know that you love your car. That car is your love. Some of you even name your cars. So then you definitely know that you like your car, or at least you love your car. And that decision that you make for the first car that you own is got to be a good decision, because you want to start, when you're starting out and you got maybe your second job, maybe it's still your first job, and you saved up the money and you want to get a car. Sometimes I would say is not the first car you've ever owned, is usually maybe the second car, because you were able to save a little bit more, maybe have a little bit nicer job. And that's what this is all about. It's about making sound decisions, trying to get a job, or rather, not trying to get a job, trying to get a car that will be able to be that you could afford, but is a lot of car for the money. It is not just what you see in the MSRP and on the sticker or any car that you walk down by a lot, or when you go by a website and see that. That's not what it's all about. It's about what you can afford based on a car that has either incentives, or a car that is used, a few years used, and that allows you to afford a better car. And that's what these tips are all about. If it's for yourself, that's extremely important. If it's for somebody else and you're giving that good advice, it's not just to save them money, it's to set the example. Let's take, for example, the very car that I'm driving here. This car is a 2014 Ford Focus, and it is the Titanium Edition. I reviewed this car before. It is a car that was purchased 2 years used. So it was purchased in 2016. I stand corrected. It was purchased in 2015, and It was considered a new car, but it was not new in that it was not the current model year. So it was one of these cars that was still left in the lot, and as a result, there was a number of incentives, and there were a number of deals that basically the dealer was motivated to have to move the car. So that's already hinting at some of the tips that I can give you to be able to afford a car that normally you think you wouldn't. And having a brand new car is not a necessity, but it is something that you may be able to own under the right conditions. So in the case of this car, let's just use this as a case in point, was a car that was sitting in the lot. The new model years had arrived. For whatever reason, the dealer had not been able to move all of its inventory. And this particular one, which is a titanium edition, was loaded with all the gadgets and options and settings that one can think about. And white was probably not the first choice. So there are some pros and cons, and that maybe you don't get to pick the color that you really want, but it's a decision that you make. Is it worthwhile saving $4,000, maybe even $5,000 because you found a car where the dealer was motivated to move it, and maybe the color was not your first choice? That's a decision that you have to make. Yeah, sure, white wasn't the first choice, but that's what turned out to be, and it was a sound decision because it represented significant savings. So going back to what we get for a car like this and what deals we can find, I already talked about getting one for a model year that is not current, that is still sitting in a dealer lot. The other thing to consider is that if the car has not been driven, so it technically is a new car, at least you get to determine the usage of the car at your own terms. And what I mean with that is that when you buy a car and you don't know who owned it, it is a little bit of a gamble whether or not you know that that car was abused. It is probably a little bit more visible on certain sports cars that are coming off of a lease. That is something that is usually somewhat of a yellow flag, I would say. On a car such as this, although they don't have a history of being abused, people that abuse their cars or people that are going to have it only for a few years, usually they will get a sports car, rev it up, not let the engine break in. So things such as that are, again, yellow flags to be cautious about. There are some reports that you can get, such as Carfax reports, that shows car history, and it gives you a good amount of information. It is not going to give you all the information that you may need, but it does give you good information. So in terms of the various options that one can do to pick up a car that has not been abused, like I mentioned before, one that's been sitting in a vehicle lot, in a dealer lot. Another one is one that has a clean record, a Carfax report. Best way is to have knowledge of who owned the car. If it's someone that you know, it doesn't get any better than that. If it's someone that someone else knows and they can speak to that, that's probably the next best thing. But for the most part, it's somewhat of a gamble. The one thing to know, and it is no secret, is that the biggest part of the depreciation of any car happens in the first few years. So when you buy a car that is a few years old, somebody else already took that depreciation. So your car usually will not depreciate as rapid as a rate as the first 2 to 3 years from when the time that it was new. If money is not an issue, then by all means feel free to buy new. I think that with the exception of one car in the fleet, most of the cars that I owned were purchased used. So it is something that does save considerable amount of money. But the part that I would probably mention is very important. It's not so much the money savings. If you're a car person and you like cars in general, and you have like all of us, we have a budget as to how much we can afford, the used car option allows you to own what would normally be a more expensive car. So if the luxury style of cars is not attainable, you then find out that in the used car market, it may be after all. If the exotic car style is or type is not attainable, it may be for you in the used car market. So that is something to also consider. But nevertheless, it's a combination of how much money are you willing to spend, how much car are you willing to get, and what it is about the decisions that you make early on in your life, in your career, or maybe you're not making those decisions for yourself, but you may have a younger brother or sister, or maybe a nephew or niece, a daughter or a son, and these are all decisions that factor in, because you're not just making the decisions for yourself, you also want these young folks to learn from those experiences early in life so that they can be able to make sound decisions with purchasing not just a car, but just anything in general. Know the value of money and what you can afford. When you're budgeting for the car, although my video is not about the budgeting experience, it is very important to know that it is not a matter of just winging it, of just thinking, well, yeah, I think I can afford this much per month or whatever it is, the payment that is going to be. It's not about that. It's about knowing that when you are getting into a car, whether it's a car payment or you are about to drop a cash amount that you've been saving up, it is something that was planned, it was something that was expected, and that once you have made that decision, it doesn't become a chore, it doesn't become a burden. It's quite common that we've seen out there where some people get into a lease or a car payment and they are miserable shortly after that because they were way over their heads, and or worse yet, the car was repossessed, picked up by the bank because the payments could not be afforded. Those are just signs that there was not enough planning going into the purchase of the car. So always plan right, budget accordingly, know how much you can afford, and the decisions that you make in terms of where the money goes, it's a personal decision. There's folks who have very expensive cars and live in apartments. There's folks who have beat up cars and live in very nice houses. I'm just using those two extremes as examples, but somewhere in between is where most of us are. That's a personal decision. But once you know how much you can afford and what you can do, and then you know what your budget is, there are many options out there. One of the options is to buy a car that has many incentives and is still considered new. Another option is to buy the used market, and there are dealerships, there are portals, web portals, where they sell cars on, not necessarily online, but you can go ahead and choose them online and go pick them up. There are a number of websites like Edmunds, Car Gurus, etc. They allow you to do searches, and the sources of all those used cars are various dealers. They sometimes are individuals, etc. So there are a number of resources out there. Of course, you can go to local dealers that have used cars. There's some specialized dealers that will sell only some specific car types or car brands. So if you're into, say, German sports cars or luxury cars or Italian sports cars, there's usually every major city has a dealer for those type of cars. And so there, again, those are options that are out there for anyone looking for a car that is maybe not brand new and you can afford a little bit more of a car. And then there are websites where people can take over leases of other cars, like lease swap and things like that. I'll put some of those links on the description below. But just giving you a lot more tips and resources that you can use to be able to find a car that you can afford, but most importantly, a car that is within your budget. If you look at how much time you spend driving, whether it's your daily commute based on the city you live, the traffic, the distance, the amount of days a week, and you add it all up, how much time you drive on the weekends, just try to come up with an average, you'll be surprised how much that really does add up. And why is that important? It's important because the decision you make on the car that you drive is a lifestyle decision, and the quality of your life, how happy you are when you get up in the morning and you get out of bed and you climb onto your car to go to work. Of course, there's a lot more that goes into that. The kind of job that you have, where you live, how much traffic you're battling. Again, I cannot speak for all those other factors, but at least on the car side, if you can at least take care of, you at least enjoy what that part of the day is when you drive, because it's either a very comfortable car, or it's a very exciting car, or it's just a very decent car. It's not a beat up car or something like that. It's very important that you get a car that you are happy with, even if you cannot afford a very high-end car. So knowing that you can use these tips to be able to afford at least a little bit better car, a car that will last you a little bit, and a car that you're truly going to love, is what it's really all about. My name is George. This is GLLR Cars. And as always, drive safe.